we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming out tonight. We'd like to welcome almost or soon to be Dr. Kyle Starkey. He is a doctoral candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Did I get it right?
Yep.
Okay. Yay. And he's also getting ready to be the father of twin girls.
Oh.
You scheduled them just in time.
Trumps the other one.
Yeah.
So he's really under the gun to get the dissertation finished and defended and all that fun stuff before the big arrival. He has been working on a research study, it's his dissertation topic, about POW camps, World War II POW camps in Oklahoma for 2-3 years now. He came to Alva a few years ago and visited the archives in our department, went to the museum, went through all of the materials at the Cherokee Strip Museum. Come on now. Regarding the POW camp that we had south of town during World War II. And so he's quite familiar with the area, and we enjoyed having him with us for a few days during that visit. So we're glad to have him back, and I think we just kind of have adopted him.
Yeah.
Part of the family. So we thank you all for joining us this evening, and at this time I'll turn it over to Dr. Schmaltz, who will introduce Kyle and more thoroughly and talk a little bit about how this came about.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Decker.
To reiterate what Dr. Decker mentioned, I just want to thank you all for attending this evening's Cultural Heritage Lecture Series. And we're very, very privileged and delighted to have Mr. Kyle Starkey to present tonight. And again, this is hosted by the Northwestern Institute for Citizenship Studies and the Department of Social Sciences. And I want to thank Dr. Decker for allowing us to use the facilities here. And by the way, I also want to thank Dr. Mason, too, for helping out some of the paperwork, too, and helping us out with some of the other details. Again, we're very delighted to have Kyle here. He's a very enthusiastic and dedicated young scholar. He's helping preserve part of our local as well as our national history on the German POW experience during World War II. He is presently seeking his PhD. He's a graduate student specializing in modern Germany, one of my pet areas too, at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in the Department of History. And we share some similar background as we were talking on the way from the airport last evening. Also noting how wide open everything is, right? From POWs to escape, there's nowhere to go. But he is also a history and German language major, like I was. He earned his bachelor's degree in history and German from Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania. And he is a native Pennsylvanian, so we have another Pennsylvanian speaking with us. He then graduated with distinction while completing his Master of Arts degree in history at Youngstown State University in Youngstown, Ohio. And he was just completing his master's there when he contacted us through email, I think back in 2014, I think, and then we were able to arrange to have him come here back in, I think, the beginning of 2015. So he was able to do some research out here. His research today, what he's presenting, is coming out of his master's thesis at Youngstown State. It was entitled Camp Alva, Suppression by Recreation. So I like that title. It sounds very German, actually. You can't have too much fun. In any case, he's an up-and-coming young scholar. His presentation tonight is called Life Behind Barbed Wire, Recreation and German POWs in the States. Again, based on his extensive research on the German camp system, both in Oklahoma and across the United States during the war. And again, one part of this larger story will be Camp Alva, again located on the south end of town by the Woods County Fairgrounds today. Again, one of the major camps in the country. So in any case, we're very, very fortunate to have him. In the future, we are working with Kyle about publishing some of his findings with our annual journal through the Institute, Civitas. So he is working on some of that down the road, so we're very lucky to have that. A few last comments too. The main presentation will last about 50-55 minutes. We'll have some PowerPoint with that, and then we'll open up the last 20, 30 minutes for any comments or questions from the audience. Again, I do have one student here from Ponca City, so I'll have you sign in with me at the end of class. And so there's some dedication. I really appreciate you showing up as well. And again, for those who are unable, I had several students who wanted to attend. I know we have some other students who are working or off campus. Eventually, we will have this videotaped and posted on the university website. It may take several weeks, but we'll try to get that up here by the end of the fall. And with that, we'll turn things over to Mr. Starkey, and it's all yours. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right.
Yeah, thanks again. First, I want to start off with that. Not only thanking the city itself, obviously, but all those helped me for the project. It is weird that it's been 2 years already. That shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be that quick. So in particular, I'd like to thank Northwestern Oklahoma State University, Professor Schmaltz and Professor Decker for their encouragement and support the past couple years. Definitely keeping in contact as well as helped. Also, I'd like to thank everyone at the Cherokee Strip Museum, the Alva Public Library, and others from the city that have attempted to preserve this important piece of American and German history from the Second World War. I hope this project and other efforts that are being made or will be made is going to allow some more growth and development, particularly with Camp Alva's story and the city's history as well. And as Professor Schmaltz said, my project had a more specific focus on Camp Alva, which I will address probably for a lot of it. I will address in length a broader context of not only the camp system, but the war, so that a greater understanding of the Nazi lager can really come about. So before we can understand the POW system, we have to start with events from the Second World War that really led German prisoners to be brought here. First and foremost, the Nazis' aggressive remilitarization, expansionist tactics throughout the 1930s had truly sparked the official start of the war. This began with the successful invasion of Poland in September of 1939. And then after several months of kind of a unique kind of stalemate almost, where countries had declared war on Germany, but nothing really happened outside of the capture of France with minimal casualties, Germany struck with the Blitz in the second half of 1940. Starting in July and lasting through October, the German forces' bombing efforts, they focused their bombing efforts on the British airfields, hoping to take out their opposition as soon as possible. Slowly but surely, the German Luftwaffe directed their resources to bombing actual cities in Great Britain, with British citizens taking refuge in railway systems, amongst other places, which you can actually see here in the top right picture of the fire surrounding St. Paul's Cathedral, becoming one of the more iconic pictures of the war. Shortly afterwards, the remnants of the British Royal Air Force stood up to a degree to the Luftwaffe, ending the Blitz with the Battle of Britain. After successes in Poland, France, and to a degree in Britain, Hitler and the German military decided to focus their efforts on a former ally, the Soviet Union. The plot to invade the Soviet Union became known as Operation Barbarossa. The operation began on June 22nd of 41 and was met again with initial successes for the Germans, in large part because of the blitzkrieg tactics and encirclement style of warfare that the Germans used in their initial waves of assault. However, the Russian forces fell back to Moscow, where men, women, children, even elderly, helped build defenses of the city. These defenses were important, but the largest influence on the Germans' operation's failure was what the Russians called the Rasputitsa, which you can actually see here in the bottom right picture. It'll be a little hard. But the Rasputitsa is essentially a point in the Soviet Union where fall rains fall heavily on Soviet lands, kind of making it very hard to travel. And the Germans weren't really prepared for that. As you can see, they're trying to get their people out of some intense mud there. This new taste of defeat for German forces continued with missions on the African front, where they came to the Italians' aid, who were trying to expand their own control. The missions in Africa became known as the Desert War, essentially started with independent Italian invasions in 1940, but a majority of the battles really began after February of 41. When the German Afrika Korps arrived to help the Italians. The Desert War in the African front continued about until 1943, when the Germans were defeated at the Battle of Tunisia. This battle and other German losses, specifically at Stalingrad and Kursk, which that bottom left picture there, I believe from Stalingrad, I think, results in an exponential boom in Axis prisoners. This huge addition of POWs that were primarily being held in the Soviet Union and Great Britain began to push these camps to capacity. As a result, the United States, who had earlier officially entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a myriad of other things, were forced to create a prisoner camp system that they would help alleviate the overcrowding in Allied camps in Europe. As American authorities began to develop their own camps, they had to be conscientious of the Geneva Convention of 1929 that guaranteed certain rights and protections to prisoners of war during World War II. This ratified version of the Geneva Convention was signed in 1929 on July 27th, after being edited to address deficiencies and lack of precision in the subject of prisoners of war brought to light at the end of the First World War. The most important changes that I want to bring to light that had a direct and clear impact on the prisoner camp system for the United States and the other countries mainly dealt with Articles 5 and 6 of Part 2. It seems really specific, but I'll get to it. But it must be said, too, that even though a lot of these countries signed the Geneva Convention, none of them were golden children in terms of following it. Everyone kind of cut some corners or found some loopholes. So Articles 5 and 6 that I alluded to earlier were basically what was supposed to happen when one was captured. These state that a prisoner must reveal their identity to the capturing authority but will not be pressured or threatened in a situation. In congruence with revealing their identity to their captors, they will be allowed to publicly demonstrate identity token, badges of rank, decorations, and articles of value that cannot be taken from prisoners. This caused a multitude of problems for the American authorities, mainly in the sense of screening prisoners and their physical experience within the camp. I was talking to Professor Schmaltz earlier, so the initial camp system was really kind of spurred on and made rather quickly, so it wasn't the best. So their screening process of deeming who was a Nazi, who was not a Nazi, wasn't really clear. Some definitions now of historians and other scholars and students are unsure of what a Nazi is and isn't. There's different degrees of it, and they struggle with that. So actually later I found a lot of transfer records, both in and out of Alva, of basically the screening process being advanced, being developed better. So there are a lot of times people who were in Alva who maybe shouldn't have been. And a lot of that has to go with these kind of ideas of revealing their identity and really getting deep into it. Even though Article 5 declares that each prisoner is supposed to reveal their true identity, it obviously resolved those problems I talked about. On the other hand, more directly related to Alva is the allowance of individuals to openly display their military regalia. The confiscation of personal items was not a problem with them in the actual POW camps, but more so in the collection camps. The collection camps were, say you were initially captured on the battlefield, you were placed essentially in these almost holding camps while they kind of figured out a place where you could go. There are several diaries from some African corpsmen who were in these collection camps upwards to 2-3 months, just moving from kind of collection camp to collection camp before they eventually arrived in the States, they arrived in Britain, Soviet camp, and so on. So as a result, Nazi soldiers were allowed to continue wearing the uniforms and display any personal material objects that got past the authorities at collection camps. Even though they were supposed to be in captivity, there was no punishing repercussions for openly displaying military uniforms and material objects that may have included Nazi insignias or propaganda. Case in point right here, which a lot of us have probably seen at the Strip Museum now, that soldiers had actually made while in captivity and had actually had in the officers' barracks. In addition to trying to build a camp system that adhered to the convention, the United States Army Provost Marshal General, that took me a while to get that down, decidedly focused on the division of Nazis from anti-Nazis, claiming it was for the protection of other prisoners and suppressing open displays of Nazi ideology by these true believers, which I refer to them in my paper. It defined these true believers as individuals that were either party members, ardent supporters of Nazi ideology, and often were the apprehended individuals that would cause the most problems for capturing authorities. These were the ones that, when doctors would come into camps, they would say, "Do not wear your necktie, you will get strangled." Those kind of threats. So not just like little, "No, I'm not going to go to work" thing, a little bit more intense than that. So as a result, the military directors decided that it would be beneficial to create a single camp to harbor these men and hopefully suppress any form of Nazi expression, ending up with Camp Alva. However, Alva's role as a permanent POW camp did not begin until the formal announcement of its construction in November of '42 by Captain Henry C. Tremblay, recorded in actually the Review Courier. He stated that it is not revealing a military secret to say that we will get prisoners of war, not enemy aliens. The unknown reporter from the Courier continues as Captain Tremblay explained further that the internees would be evacuated from England and that some of them would be captives from Marshal Rommel's forces off the Libyan front. Tremblay clarified that the small contingent of prisoners would eventually start to arrive around December 15th of that year until a complete complement of 600 men was present. These kinds of arrivals were the norm at Alva, basically coming in chunks. But the route that the POWs had to take was always changing in the first few months because of people wanting to see who these enemies were and to basically just watch them come to town. It was almost like an event. Before prisoners could even be held at Alva, the physical camp had to be developed. The camp was originally planned to house 3,000 internees who were to be segregated into 3 compounds according to nationality. It was not succinctly documented, but the designation of Camp Alva as the Nazi camp occurred during its construction, mainly because of its geographical location, which again Professor Schmaltz alluded to. It's really flat, and you can see for miles if they try to get away. So the concept would eventually change, though, in 2 ways apart from that. The first is that Camp Alva and the others in Oklahoma would become strictly confined to housing just German POWs. At first, like I said, by nationality, they were thinking Italian POWs, Germans, and in Richard Wagner's Barbed Wire Nazi Loggers, he clarifies that only German POWs were held in Oklahoma, but there were some Italians. Not a lot, but they were often used for work details, which I'll get into a little bit earlier. And then some were also patients at the hospital at Milwaukee, which I had to get that right, how to say that. The second aspect is that the camp grew to hold 4 total compounds, which were separated by rank. In other words, there was a separate officer barrack, along with barracks for commissioned and non-commissioned soldiers. Along with the barracks, the camp was filled with a plethora of other buildings, including a recreation area, library, infirmary, canteen fill, and other administrative buildings, which were all built on a square mile of land 1 mile south and west of Alva. Interestingly, because of the angst that was growing amongst the Alva citizens after the announcement of Captain Tremblay, Alva natives were invited to actually come and tour the facilities that were being built for the German prisoners before they arrived. But this was after the first American guards had showed up. This was to assure the public that the necessary security measures were being used to keep the Alva communities secure. The first group of guards, which I said, about 19 of them, arrived on July 11th of '43 by truck, and when the prisoners began to arrive a few months later, they were in those larger groups. They would come by train, and then from the station, they would have a regular march route that was set up where they would march in long columns, complete silence, basically kept to do nothing. Which, again, if you've been to the Cherokee Strip Museum, there's that very blurry footage, right? That was a snuck of the men coming in. And what you actually see in that mural, too, and I'll go back to it really quick, is actually, these are the men hypothetically coming back, right, or actually being brought to this town. And they would often not have shoes. They would be wearing burlap sacks because the German military forces were obviously scrounging for supplies at times. And oftentimes their clothes would be ripped to shreds and be bloody still from being taken directly away from the battlefields. Once the prisoners were within the camp, though, they were faced with 8 high-foot fences dividing each of the compounds, while the officers' compound was surrounded by 2 8-foot-high fences. So if not one, 2's better. For security purposes, 13 guard towers were arranged along the fences. All the buildings were temporarily built of wood, and they were later sold to the general public starting after the camp was deactivated in November of '45. Throughout the history of the camp, there was a flux of prisoners in and out that never reached the full capacity of 6,000 that it became, the largest amount at one time being about 4,900. In its existence, the camp established its own personality and reputation that was not only known by those in Alva, but also by prisoners, American military, and citizens throughout the country. Now, while Camp Alva was one of roughly 30 camps in Oklahoma, let alone the larger American camp system as a whole, there's one thing that each and every camp shared: some form of recreation. But what did differ with these kinds of recreation, that each camp used it differently. So for example, camps other than Alva used prisoners as a workforce on a larger scale than Alva did, providing the prisoners with a job, a wage to be used in the camp, and something to keep the prisoners distracted. One of these camps resided in Texas near Piney Woods. At this camp, prisoners worked in the southern lumber industry, providing significant contributions to the southern economy. This trend of using German prisoners as a labor force continued with probably one of the more famous examples of German prisoners working on Augusta National, where the Masters Golf Tournament is held. German prisoners actually contributed to rebuilding the course. I think particularly the 13th hole was all them, without any real monitoring. And they were rebuilding it because during the war it was closed down. It was used mainly for pastures for cattle. So what's also interesting with some of these camps compared to Alva is these men, when they would go to work detail, were sometimes not even monitored. They would just walk to the field and back. They knew where they were going. That did not happen at Alva at all. And this isn't to say that there were not other common forms of recreation at these camps. There obviously were. But workforce became a mainstay for these camps, all the way from camps in Massachusetts to California, than there were at any point at Alva. Workforce was used at Alva, but not to the degree it was at these places. The degree of prisoner held at Alva took away the possibility of that extensive labor. There was some outside, as I said, but a reason that kind of changed, not only with the workforce and then recreation, resided in the leadership at the camp. So this memorandum right here from March 21st of 44, it came from the initial camp commander at Alva, Colonel Ralph Hall. He posted this scathing memorandum attacking the malingering tactics of the German POWs at Alva on the base. The letter was basically a culmination of Colonel Hall's attempts to turn his camp inmates, those taken from the most ardent Nazis and troublemakers, and make them an efficient workforce. It didn't work out. He stripped away their beer privileges, threatened to change the diet in the canteen to one that was not suited to a more German European palate. These punishment techniques were not the first he had instituted, and overall they failed to create the workforce he desired. A few days later, Colonel Hall's tenure as head of Camp Alva was over, and higher authorities overturned his orders. So a new leadership at the camp emerged, which sought to keep Camp Alva prisoners in line with alternative activities rather than meting out constant punishment. Recreational facilities and activities proved to be more effective means within the strictures of the Geneva Convention of coercing these Nazi POWs under American control to behave as best as possible given the ardent nature of their ideological beliefs. After this new leadership took over, specifically under Colonel Murray Gibbons, which we'll talk about later, and Lieutenant Colonel H.H. Richardson, these orders were replaced with a significantly less intimidation policy. So what I'm about to get into now is more about the recreation at Alva, and the source material for here often comes from these guys right here, like Major Frank Brown, who was a representative with the Swiss legation. Basically, they would come to camps, do a report, talk to a prisoner spokesman, and see what the morale was at the camp, make some notes about what the camp was like, basically down to the canteen to everything at the camp, essentially. Everything had its own subsection. There's a lot of these that are left from what is left from Alva. This is what you're going to see a lot of here. So this visit right here, we'll get into it a little bit, but one of the other visits from July 2nd to the 4th was from Captain Robert V. Estes, who explained that there was little to no recreational distractions in place in 43, but there was a recreation area that consisted of one single large field by 44. This large field was only available for a 2-hour minimum for each compound that was organized into a schedule. The officers' compound possessed a separate and fenced recreation area of their own. This shows a clear difference between the officers and enlisted men that began to take shape under Hall. Hall kept that military alignment and hierarchy in play. Officers had clear and different standards in the early years of the camp, and recreation began to take shape apart from work. They still adhered to the convention theoretically, but the minimal nature of recreation that we'll see in the hours correlate with an extremely strict security on the prisoners in the camp. Along with addressing the minimalistic nature of recreation at the camp shortly after it was opened, Estes gives two very insightful plans on how to improve the camp and improve recreation. The first was to take place in 3 stages. The first stating that double wire fences now existing between compounds 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 should be extended further, making it a larger area. And then the second piece saying that a simple guard tower in the middle of the newly expanded far side of the area, so basically just plopping one right in the middle. So for any postmodern fans in Foucault, there's your panopticon for you. So finally, single gauge should be installed between compound 1 and the recreation area between the compounds. So basically you're creating 2 larger fields and kind of opening things up a little more. On the other hand, the second plan that Estes details includes a disclaimer that if, this plan should be followed only if the first isn't financially possible. Which would essentially create, would eliminate the wire bolt pen in compound 2, and basically he's getting at, and it's a lot of mumbo jumbo. It's like you start swimming in numbers 1 through 3 that he repeats over and over again. But essentially he's trying to create different ways to make the recreational area larger and in different configurations to give these guys more space. This change in recreation at Alva shows that the Swiss legation and American authorities began to realize that the policies in place might not have been the greatest plan to control Nazi enthusiasts. Thus, they connected recreation and the availability of it to the morale in the camp. After the recommended plans by Estes in July, a new report from Paul Schneider on August 15th of 1944 shows a completely new image of recreation at Alva. Snyder generally remarks in the subsection of recreation that each sector has organized an orchestra along with having a sufficient number of indoor games at their disposal. Recreational activities and spaces were developed to the point that Snyder had to include the subsection education, sports, religious services, and work. One of the most interesting to note is the section titled sports, which stated that each sector had its own sports field. The equipment is sufficient, but the men request footballs, which are now difficult to obtain. The inclusion of a sports field in each sector makes it apparent that the leadership at Alva responded aptly to the report and suggestions by Estes. Furthermore, the inclusions of more recreational venues support this transformation of mentality and leadership that occurred since Hall's departure in March of '44. So go back to that to kind of show you where we're at. So ruling with this iron fist obviously failed, and the following camp commanders realized this by providing more of those subsections that we just talked about with sports, music, library, education, and so on. And it would distract and deter prisoners from acts that were detrimental to a camp's purpose. Right? The reason that these assumptions can be made about the role of recreational spaces and activities is largely based on the incidents and responses that were explained by these reports from the Swiss representatives. In the early years of the camp where recreation was limited, there were countless numbers of small incidents. Additionally, there were many complaints to the Swiss legation about how men were being treated. One of the strongest inclinations was when prisoners held at Alva claimed that they were treated like criminals and that they were being held in a punishment camp. One of the instances that occurred that reflected this was when an individual was transferred to the camp. They were instantly forced to spend the night in jails established for ordinary criminals. This kind of tension resulted in some acts of violence. In the same report, there was a mutiny on November 9th of '43 where prisoners refused to attend their work detail. The strict enforcement of policies while still attempting to follow the Geneva Convention resulted in punishment that only further angered the prisoners. On the other hand, once the formal leadership was taken out of the equation, the representatives reported that morale had significantly improved. This may have been in large part because of the change in leadership, but the personnel also brought expansions to recreation that correlate significantly more than the changes in leadership. This is the case because as the camp progressed and leadership changed under the several different commanders, recreational freedoms for the most part stayed the same after the immediate drastic changes. Thus all the recreational space and activities mentioned are exemplary examples of how Camp Alva partially succeeded to resolve the struggle between the Geneva Convention and the attempt to control the graded prisoners there. Although the 3 previously described visits had direct connections to the inclusion of sports at the camp, there was a plethora of other visits that narrate the importance of sports at Alva. One of these is from Major Frank Brown here, from his visit in '44. In this report gives a general expression of recreational activities, and one of them is considered game sports for recreational kids. The section states, kits furnished by the PMG have been received and are in use. The stockade recreation field is very muddy and generally unsuitable for use except in the driest weather, during which time it is available to compounds on a roster basis because of the segregation policy in place. Soccer and flatball are played within compounds on the fields arranged in available space. Several times recently, guards have fired upon prisoner players who have approached the deadline to retrieve a ball. The field available within the compound is necessarily small and close to the fence line because of the arrangements of the buildings, which allow very little space. Competition in sports is held within the compounds, but competition between compounds is forbidden because of the segregation policy. Within the incomplete records that have survived from Alva, there's no indication of what was in these kits, but the documentation on the field is very telling of the leadership and their mentality. During this time, Colonel Hall was still the leader, so the strict security was still in play. As a result, the upkeep of the recreational facilities was not seen as important, as shown with the poor drainage of the field. Furthermore, instances where prisoners were shot at during recreation time reveals the strict mentality that the guards had at this camp to not let prisoners wander outside of what they felt was comfortable. One of these examples was explained in the prisoner complaints section of the same report, stating restricted spaces in the compounds requires the players to approach near the deadline, or the 2-hour limit, and that two players have been fired upon recently by guards, although they had raised their hands above their heads before running for the ball. The prisoners were told that it would be appropriate in the future for prisoners to await signals from the guards before retrieving the ball. Over a year later, another individual, Alva Goetz, visited the camp in April of '45, so a lot later down that timeline. And the situation had drastically changed. Each compound had its own sports field and highly organized recreational program. The mentioning of a sports field for each compound was alluded to in a previous visit, but the differences between these two visits in particular show the importance of sports to the prisoners and the resulting distractions from this imprisonment. After Hall was taken out, Colonel Gibbons and Colonel Richardson had really focused on improving this. And these leaders understood this importance and used it to lighten the load of restrictions that were under Hall. In the final remarks from the representative, he stated, compared to previous visits, there is little doubt that a marked improvement has been brought about by the present commander, and the morale was formerly unusually troublesome camp. The use of a sports field for the prisoners was clearly one of the most important to them, and reading about these differences shows obvious changes. However, there are obvious differences in other kinds of recreation, such as music and theater within Camp Alva. So, in the visit that we talked about earlier with Major Brown in '44, there was an explanation of music and theater at the camp. Specifically, Brown and others who had visited broke down music and theater and reporting on the camp's orchestras, symphonies, and theater. Brown began his report on the orchestra with a subsection, prisoner orchestras and theatricals. Brown states each compound, with the exception of the officers' compound, has its own orchestra. The orchestras at Alva became very popular in the camp, but they were limited by a single theater building whose use was arranged by roster. At first glance, this appears to be a great addition, right, to the distractions at Alva, and it was, but then Brown details that there were still complications in regards to it. For example, at that time, the theater had not been used because the commanding officer closed it for repairs, which is literally in quotations in this guy's report, which shown, from that, it gives the impression that Brown did not really believe that it was closed for repairs. Instead, it can be assumed it was closed for a more controlling reason. As a result, it would be surprising that the improper wiring arranged by the prisoners within the building, which caused a fire hazard, was a fabricated story to deter the prisoners from having any more additional freedom. Since Hall was not blatantly taking the theater away from them, he was not violating convention, so one of the instances where he finds a loophole. The theater was used for these orchestras and symphonies, but one of the most interesting uses of the theater became the showing of various films. Brown explains that a 16mm projector and rented films were purchased with the POW fund, but because of the theater being closed for repairs, it was not available to any of the prisoners to watch. In this report, there's a myriad of complaints from the prisoner spokesman about the theater and its uses. So Brown reports that some of the band members complained the majority of their instruments were old and required a lot of repair. And it was also interesting that NCOs, or non-commissioned officers, and others took the better instruments, which caused a degree of infighting amongst the POWs. On the other side, prisoners were not allowed to see some of the films that they had requested. There was a great deal of censorship in those. So I mean, what better film to show them than a Frank Capra film? However, in future reports, the complaints changed from how the prisoners were being treated and what they were given to concerns about the actual equipment used. So some of the POWs were concerned that if they took the film equipment outside, it would result in dust getting into it and ruining it. In other words, this change from, well, the petty fighting had continued, but now it had changed from what they were getting to how it was going to be ruined or how someone was going to mess it up. This terminology continued on with the camp visitor remarking about Gibbons, who was at this time the camp commander, that he was just and fair and appreciated the role of allowing no opportunity for any of the prisoners to indulge in pastimes which might have been the reason for their being transferred to Alva. This was in large part thanks to more recreation. So along with the development of sporting grounds, there was a German education program that became a huge deterrent from activities seen as polar opposites to what American authorities wanted. One of the first mentions of this from the primary documents that are available was between the camp spokesman, which is essentially the prisoner representative, Karl Smej, and Miss Helda Steck. Steck was a security for the Special Book Service of the War Prisoners' Aid of the YMCA. So through this special book service, the YMCA donated millions of books to Allied soldiers, along with enemy prisoners held in the U.S. Smej's letter with an attached list stated, "I have the privilege of requesting further help in supplying our school library with more material. Doubtlessly, it will not be possible to supply us with all desired books. However, I would beg you to ship us all the books on this list that you can get hold of within the next 3 months. I may add here that we are in a position to pay in full for all books that you might be able to ship on this order." Smej ends his letter thanking the YMCAs for their help and included a 3-page list of books. This list is separated into different categories: German language, history, geography, physics, engineering, amongst others. So based on these categories, Smej in particular was interested in educational purposes. So this is the first mention of the program that was detailed to have 2,000 students. There was no inclination of how the program was approved and who was approved by, but the date on the letter is a few months after Hall had retired, and more freedoms were being granted. Now this program is not to be confused with re-education programs that were popular in other Allied POW camps. The re-education program essentially attempted to teach prisoners the wrongs of their ways by teaching them the authorities' own government. So Soviet camps, they would teach Germans about communism, and the United States would teach them the great ways of democracy. The U.S. program focused on convincing and teaching teaching the anti-Nazis that were imprisoned because Nazi enthusiasts were often set in their ways in the views of the Americans, that they would undermine this re-education program. The education program at Alva appears to have been more of a program that was another way for prisoners to distract themselves. It was largely prisoner-driven, and to escape the monotony of prisoner life. 2 months before the letter from Smez and Steck, Howard Hong, another report, stated that after his visit in July of '44, that summer has slowed up the school somewhat. The non-commissioned officers continue much of their schoolwork during both the day and evening. The enlisted men hold evening classes, and the officers at any convenient time. Apart from the NCOs and commissioned officers attending the classes, the format of them was usually lectures that were being held from noon till 4, or sometimes later in the evening for those who did have work detail. From the small description of the classes and Hong mentioning the educational leaders' dedication to the program to get books through the book loan service, it is clear that the educational program became important to the German NCOs and officers. The education program not only provided another area of escape for the prisoners, but it was also another area for distraction that American authorities allowed. Since the work detail was minimal, Paul Snyder remarks in 44 that they, late 44, they have all the time they need to organize a very complete curriculum. During Snyder's visit, one learns more about the subject matter of the coursework with the explanation that there are a variety of language courses, English, French, German, Russian, and Spanish, to be the more popular ones. Furthermore, the courses began in the fall and included the study of many extremely varied subjects and university courses. So it actually had general high school up to university level. And they were divided into 3 groups where the NCOs had a variety of different courses, from language back to the agriculture and physics that we talked about. And then the enlisted men had more of a secondary education, as they would work all day, take their courses in the evenings. The first sector of the non-commissioned officers were offered 22 subjects with 46 classes with an audience of 1,700 prisoners. The second sector, which was just the regular enlisted men, they had 12 subjects, 17 classes, and 300 auditors. The third sector was in more non-commissioned officers. They had 28 subjects, 98 courses, and 3,600 auditors. Apart from courses given in the division of students among all those courses, the report reveals that there were 2 divisions of secondary schooling that took about 93% of total students, and 3% which were in the university studies. In addition to Snyder's visit, another visit in November of the same year provides more data about how the classes were being ran. Amongst all these students, 94% of officers and 95% of NCOs attended the varying courses, while only 40 to 50% of enlisted men attended them as well. This disparity between enlisted men and officers, to me, seems not because the enlisted men didn't want to attend, but it was because the enlisted men were the ones that were working. They were the ones that had the work detail. Thus, there were larger numbers of officers and NCOs who were not allowed to work, needed to find more means of production that would provide an escape from their prison life. The final visit that mentions the Camp Alva School occurred in 45, going back to Offen Gertz. And he's a really small section that says that schoolwork has been organized by the prisoners of war themselves, and a number of flourishing classes are in swing. In correlation with the previous statistics, this is exactly the case. Once the program was allotted and Carl Smedge was able to get the respective books from the YMCA, the education program took off for the prisoners and officers. In the end, the education system may have been one of the most developed places for recreation at the camp. This was mainly because it was initiated after a friendlier and more atmosphere was established under Gibbons. This allowed for a complete planning and organizational process that was not deterred like the theater and library. In earlier administrations, it became a more continuous process. One of the lesser documented sources, and kind of opposing the educational program, was the chaplain or religious services. During the original administration and their policies, there was actually no explanation or description at all of a chaplain outside of the common notes about services every so often, basically for major holidays. However, once the newer administration and policies were put into place, there's a larger discussion of religious services. In the report from July of 8th and 9th of 1944, a Swiss representative states that the only religious service in the compound since Palm Sunday was July 8th, a funeral service. Hong continued stating that the tone and content of the service was nationalistic rather than Christian. In essence, a nationalistic sentiment was provided to the service, probably because of the nature of where the comrade is being buried in the United States, not Germany. They wanted to provide a proper burial service for this particular individual. After this report, there's another from December of 44, where religious service are mentioned in passing. Regular religious services have now been resumed under the direction of the American chaplain. There are two officer chaplains, one Catholic and one Protestant, who conduct the religious services. They are assisted by other chaplains and captive clergy. A chapel building is now provided for religious services. The theological study group mentioned in the last report continues. There is no indication of why only by late 1944 that regular services are being provided, but one can assume it was because they did not have the proper facilities, since the report states that chapel was just erected for religious purposes. Furthermore, it is interesting to note that a theological study group is being held in addition to the German Rand education. This is proof that religion took a multifaceted role in recreation, distracted men with services and stereotypes, but also it allowed for an upholding of individual faith for the men being held captive. Even though religion was an obvious plus for recreational privileges in the camp, once the policies were less severe and strict under Hall, some POWs were able to use those platforms to express more Nazi ideals and propaganda. In a report from a visit, one discovers that one of the German chaplains, Major Werner, was using his power to preach Nazi ideology. In the end, these were just some of the discussions of religion and religious services at the camp. Religion was obviously important for the prisoners and guards, but the reports on the prison chapel reveals that the expansion of recreation was not always a positive thing, because it sometimes offered an opportunity for expression by the prisoners in a more private setting. In the September visit, immediately after Camp POW was open, there's an indication of a small collection of books was present within the camp. Over time, these collections became an actual library. Even though it had grown from a small collection of about 50, Major Brown indicated that the library still did not contain a lot of books. And the problem was addressed as the commanding officer had instructed the canteen officer to prepare an order to the New York publishers for books to be paid from the POW fund. Although these instructions had been given some time before the visit of this officer, the written order had not even been prepared. The canteen officer stated that he was unable to find sufficient sources of supplies for books. He was referred to neighboring camps, which had excellent sources for the purchase of German and English books. In accordance with earlier policies, the library was hindered by Colonel Hall's policies and mentalities towards the prisoners. Even though there was a fund available to buy things like the theater projector and other books, prisoners reported to Swiss representatives that they had been forbidden to purchase books individually unless they had enough funds in their account, and even if they did, no books were ever ordered and sent to the prisoner. While the books had to be censored and monitored by the American authorities, things drastically changed within the camp library system within Alva. After a visit in August of '44, one discovers that now 2 libraries are created, one for officers and one for non-commissioned officers and enlisted men. Along with the surprising changes in the library, the visitor from the Swiss legation reveals that the officers' library contains 450 books, while the other had over 4,700. Although the prisoners had spent altogether the prisoners had spent $2,000 in books. The clear differences that are seen in a single year and with different leadership reveals that not only the camp was expanding and prisoners were receiving more freedoms, but the leadership understood that with more recreation and distractions for prisoners, less problems would occur. A large reason that these kinds of numbers were even possible in the Nazi lager was because of a specific limitation set by the Geneva Convention, with another article stating that prisoners of war shall be permitted to receive individually co-signed books, which may be subject to censorship. Along with various organizations controlled by the capturing authorities could send books as well. One example of this is actually coming from Johannes Kunze, who wrote a letter home stating, "Dear Erna, I'm well. I'm getting older and slower. Playing football, I am not able to keep up anymore. The days go by and thinking once in a while a game of chess, some English lessons, also French. I do not bother about the sequence of the days of the week or the date. The companionship of the other prisoners is good. The report, according to the newspaper here, is that Leipzig and Dresden were bombed. I hope you will spare any misfortune also in the future. In Salah, you are permitted to send me books, so will you please?" Although Kunze was imprisoned at Camp Chickawa in Oklahoma, this short letter shows the importance of books to the prisoners' bland and monotonous way of life. Each prisoner would have the same routine, boredom, and general loneliness, leading to frustration that Kunze alludes to by not even keeping track of date or time. The interesting part of this quote, however, is his asking his wife for books. There was a substantially large library within the camp that held a plethora of educational books that we know, and other literary works. The reading of these books provided one major thing for the German prisoners: escapism. Now, this picture you actually see here are actual library cards that the Cherokee Strip Museum has, which we literally stumbled onto when I was here doing research, and I felt like a little kid in a candy store looking at all these. It was amazing. So, from the library Camp Alva, I mean, hundreds of these library cards have survived. Each library card is on a traditional 4x6 note card. Each note card is set up as more of like a portrait orientation, so you can kind of see it right here, like that, with the book title and the author up top. And then underneath that was where the prisoners would actually sign their name, and then a due date would be placed. Sadly, few of those names are actually eligible, which would have been even more awesome. But you can see how often these books were checked out and how popular they were. Amongst all these cards, there's about a group of 20 to 40 that were completely filled out front and back, and some even had a second card started. Obviously, you remember reading these books, but the question came up, how can reading of these books reflect Alva prisoners? The answer to this question is partially answered by Wilma Parnell, who utilized a quotation from Corporal Kuntz earlier, saying, "Reading lists mirror the minds of the readers." One of the most interesting and popular books was Johannes Bonsoff's Lachen des Lebens. Bonsoff was born December 20th, 1907 in Stuttgart, and will eventually become a publisher for the Bertelsmann Verlags during the Nazi regime. Along with working in a prominent role during Hitler's reign, Bonsoff took an active role within National Socialism by applying and serving in the Waffen-SS. In the last years of the war, Bonsoff was detained for charges of corruption when he was caught making blank forms for the publishing house. He was able to get past the charge and continue to work in the publishing industry post-war. Along with his experience as an SS soldier, as a publisher, he edited one of the most successful German publications during the Second World War, Lachen des Lebens, ein Buch voll herzhaften Humors, so laughing life, a book of hearty humors. The book was mainly a collection of humorous stories. The fact that Bonsoff was a Nazi officer and edited one of the most successful books, not only in Nazi Germany, but the camp itself, makes sense. Not only did they know the work and that it was coming from someone who was part of the party, was a Waffen-SS member, but it was something that they had already been accustomed to in the German nation. Lachen des Lebens not only contained humorous stories, but it included illustrations to accompany some of the stories, and also a poem, which was titled Was soll ich machen, so what should I do, by Fritz Voyka. And the poem itself is interesting by itself, by the content. The narrator is a father who begins the poem with an explanation that after he wakes up on Sunday morning, issues that face his family on a day-to-day basis, the issues are laughable, as the narrator talks about the children and girls with plappernde Zungen, so blabbering tongues. But each stanza is finished with the mantra, "What will I do except laugh?" The meaning of this poem, probably for these prisoners, was to kind of take what was being put in front of them in this monotonous life of being a prisoner, and to kind of take everything inside. And it was also a moment that would have been a positive one for those who were being imprisoned. And the use of the family as a centerpiece for the poem would allow them to kind of reminisce about their own life back then with their own family. All these lighthearted connections apply more to the individual identity and mentality of a prisoner, but the familiarity of the text with the history of the editor in Nazi Germany appeals more to the national identity within the camp. As a result, there should be no question that Lachen des Lebens was one of the more, if not the most popular piece and important piece of literature at Camp Alva because of its popularity in Germany and the comedic stories that came along with it. So, as I said before, the camp, and that's really it on recreation at least, but so the camp finally gets deactivated in November of '45, where a lot of the men that were held there were expatriated to British camps first. Expatriation for any German prisoner was a long process. And for these guys, it was no different. When they got to the British camps, they could have been there for several weeks, they could have been there for several months, waiting to actually be allowed to go back to Germany. And when they got back to Germany, sometimes they did not have a home to go back to, right? So these guys had a very hard situation to come back with. But the popularity of what they became known as the Heimkehr was a huge part of German or post-war Germany. It's basically like any time we see any of the videos online of an American soldier coming back, right? Where instantly everyone probably starts crying. It was those types of situations where it was seen as a small victory for the country, for a family, for the individual. And the other thing I wanted to say before I ended up was, I think it can't be overlooked that when we did have those that returned to Oklahoma in around the 1980s, or in the 1980s, that these men were probably those that were on anti-Nazis, that didn't identify with the Nazi party, that were screened and sent to the camp for poor reasons. They stood up at one point and then when they shouldn't have, right? That's what happened at the initial part. So I think that's what we have to keep in mind when we think about the discussion between, was it a Nazi camp, was it not? It was, but maybe not at the beginning, until the screening and interrogation process got a lot better. Because then also, too, those who identify with the Nazi party probably would not come back. But yeah, so, I mean, Camp Alva's history within the terms of recreation and the leadership at the camp, I think, reveals something very telling about not only the camp itself, but what recreation can mean for people behind barbed wire. Thank you. So, any questions?
You're mentioning the riot, that was November 9th of 43. I was just thinking that's the 20th anniversary, one day after the 20th anniversary of the Nazi putsch. I wonder if there's a date, or if it's a coincidence or a correlation.
I didn't actually even think of that.
It just occurred to me.
Yeah, well, and that was the other thing too, is there was never source material that would expound upon these things. I think that one was what often got referred to as the Battle of Alva.
Okay.
And even then, the only source that was on it was in the Review Courier, and it was a little piece, maybe that big,
Yeah.
and like that long of text. So it was hard to find those instances, and I think part of it has to go back with what some of the insecurities were when they allowed some of those from the community to come in to look at the camp, right? I mean, when you hear Nazi, especially when you go back to the 1940s, that's terrifying, right? That they're going to be living miles from you. So I think that's maybe why it's not in the sources maybe as much. But yeah, I didn't even think of that.
You can footnote me on it. No, okay.
Was there ever a record show up of how many men died out there?
Yes, within the camp itself, at least the ones that were documented, there's 5. One was shot as he was trying to escape. Several died of, I think 2 or 3 died from some type of disease that they had picked up. And I forget what the last one was. The last one actually had like a natural cause. It was like a heart attack or something like that. So there actually was not any, which that also surprised me, in terms of what was documented, there was not any cases of a group or so, or more than just 1 or 2 here and there that died at the same time. There were instances of the Swiss representatives being called in, particularly during Hall, which I didn't get to get into as much here, because it didn't really connect with recreation, where these men were being embarrassed for trying to escape and being caught. So there was, so the PW uniform that you saw in a couple of the pictures, after these men tried to escape, they would basically do a scarlet letter. They would do a big E on their uniform, and they would basically, like the American personnel would, like kind of taunt them and talk smack on them, essentially for trying to escape and then being caught and embarrassing them even more. And that was interesting to read too, and there was a lot of like reports on that one particular case. I'm trying to remember their names. It was Wolf and Herner, or Werner. These 2 guys in particular. But there were other instances of escapes where they were caught. No one ever really truly escaped. I think the furthest that anyone got was these 2 when they got to Kansas City. So
where are the bodies? Where are the
Yes.
bodies?
The one that had the religious service, I think. See, and that was the other thing. They didn't really say that in the report, but I'm pretty sure from talking to Professor Schmaltz that I think they may have taken them to Fort Reno.
Could be.
Right?
Could be.
Yeah. So I think if maybe that's where they are now, and maybe at the time, they kind of.
I think the cemetery at Fort Reno was the POW cemetery for several camps.
Yeah, there
Yeah,
were
I know
several,
there's
including
a
some
talk-
Italians
there's a talk
too.
of all
Yeah.
Mhm.
prisoner
Yeah. Yeah. Which.
for them.
Yeah, which when it comes up with like those 5 men dying and everything, there's no real talk about that. And then that one religious service, there's no real indication of where it was. There might have been a service at the chaplain, and then they took the body to Fort Reno to be buried. It didn't go
I know some after the war too, I think, were relocated.
Yeah, I know at Tonkawa, they buried him at Tonkawa,
Mhm.
and then after the war, they removed it.
Oh,
There
okay.
were some.
So it may have been a situation like that, but it's not really clear.
And there may have been a couple of cases too after the war where some bodies were taken back to Germany. I'm not sure, but a
Yeah.
small number.
Yeah.
I'd have to check on that.
Mhm.
So the picture of the orchestra,
Mhm.
that's at Camp Alva?
No.
Oh.
No, that's the, I'm sorry,
got
yeah,
that.
no, I'll say that up front. I probably
I
should
was
have
gonna
said
say, it
that
looks
at
pretty
the beginning.
nice.
Yeah, no, some of these pictures
That's good.
I just had to find
Yeah.
some because there weren't a lot
I didn't
from
think of
Alva.
that, yeah.
Outside of, I mean, more of like the handicraft artifact type stuff.
Okay.
Aaron's by
Yeah,
telephone.
so sadly, no, but,
So while you were at our museum researching, you stumbled across the library cards,
mhm.
and they did not know they had them?
I don't know if they didn't know they had them or if it was they didn't know what they were looking at. It wasn't really like
Really?
explain. Yeah, because they pulled them out, and at first I was like, "Oh my god, identification cards! This is the coolest thing ever." And as I started to spread them out, and I started translating what was on top, and then just reading all these names, it was clear that these were obviously books. I mean, and some of the other ones I talk about in the full paper. I mean, there's other ones. There's more like adventure stories. There's actually one which was really interesting and surprising. There was one actually by a Jewish author that his book that was there was actually then put on like the do not read list, essentially, in Nazi Germany. But I think why though, and it goes back to what was familiar to them, is it was published well before Hitler comes to power. You know what I mean? It was almost not a classic, but it had been around for a while.
Okay.
So, do you know what happened to the library holdings after?
No, that's like basically, it's funny. So outside of that last report that I got to that said the latest report that is available at the National Archives too, where a lot of this is at, is April 18th and 19th of 1945. By the time it gets to November, like there's a big chunk of time that just vanishes, and then there's literally one sheet of paper that says this camp was deactivated in November 1945. So they may have said something to that. German soldiers may have taken it with them. You know what I mean? If they basically said, take what you want. I mean, I'm not entirely sure.
But there was no auction? I mean, how did people buy the buildings?
Well, okay, with that, they basically, from what I got, and again, it's like I'm having to do a lot of piecework here, is that they were reconfigured to almost be like model homes, right? And then they were essentially put into kind of like communities almost, like they were just kind of lined up almost. That's what I got out of it, but they may have also been auctioned as well. I'm not entirely
They're
sure.
scattered around the
Yeah.
county.
Yeah, and I know too that stuff like the one mural that's at the Cherokee History Museum was found behind one of the walls. So when they were configuring these, they were just like, okay, there, it's ready. Yes.
I think the city ended up owning most of those buildings.
Okay.
They had their own auctions for them.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's several scattered around town. You can recognize the long skinny ones as being the barracks.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But with, again, with like what the archives have and stuff, it's not.
There's a man by the
They
name-
weren't concerned about that.
Yeah.
there was a man by the name of Ed Reasoner that moved here. He was a house mover, and he knew there was going to be a lot of house moving involved.
Yeah. I can imagine for sure.
Is there any indication there might be other surprises in the museum? Or will it just take time to perhaps?
I think that's one of, and I mean, I know we talked about public history earlier, so I think that's one of any museum or any collection's problem with the archives is someone ultimately finding that kind of like needle in the haystack, and actually, and being intrigued by it, right? I mean, who knows how long those would have been here if someone else, you know what I mean, if I wasn't here snooping around trying to just find anything, hey, whatever you have, give it to me, you know what I mean? So, I mean, and I don't think that's entirely unique or genuine to the Street Museum or any other place.
where they.
But there might be, you know what I mean? There might be. I was only here for 4 or 5 days at the most. If I was here for a month, I would probably tear the whole place apart and find more stuff.
Were they in the military room or where?
No, they were, I forget her name now. She was, I think, a student who was doing an internship there. But she basically went back to one of the storage rooms
Yeah.
and pulled this out and said, there's a lot of these, they look like they could help you out. Like, let me know what they are,
Yeah, what
essentially.
you're talking about.
Yeah.
But you say they were relatively illegible, is that what you said?
Yeah, well, at least in terms of the names. And a lot of them are in cursive, so the kind of writing is kind of unclear. But the titles are pretty clear for the most part. They were actually looked like they were done in kind of like like more of like an ink pen or something like that. So they've held up pretty well. And actually the ones that have second cards or more, they're actually labeled with that. So card 1 of 3, 2, you know, I mean 2 of 2, something like that. So.
Well, maybe you need to come back and stay a while.
Maybe.
You might find the books.
Yeah, right, yeah. I'll just, once the girls come, I'll train them and then they can come help, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that'll work.
Little teeny bitty.
Yeah, so.
So in your research of other camps, how do the artifacts that we have here compare?
In terms of what the soldiers left behind, that kind of thing, or?
Yeah, you know, like the big swastika and some of those artworks that
Mhm.
we happen to have.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I can only account for like some of like I know there's been a lot written about North Carolina from Robert Billinger. He's also written on a couple other camps in South Carolina, and then some other, and like there's also a book about ones in Utah and Wyoming, that kind of thing. And they're never entirely clear what's left behind in terms of like these kind of material objects, material culture that can kind of be used. I think this camp is probably providing us the clearest and most, obvious forms of Nazi expression. You know what I mean? I mean, you're not going to go to all these camps and just see this hanging around.
Right.
So I think in terms of something like this, that is something entirely genuine to Alva. But stuff like the handkerchiefs that are there, some of the other like the models of homes and castles that they had made, I think those probably would have happened at other camps. They would have had that opportunity. But something as obvious as this probably wouldn't have happened, not because it wouldn't have been allowed, but because of who was there. They probably would have felt more willing to do that and spend
So-
time on something like that to display it.
Really, the written records, the artifacts that we have remaining need to be really protected and used for educational
Oh,
purposes.
definitely. I mean, especially when it comes to something like this is something so stark and
Yeah.
polarizing that when you look at it and then you realize this was not something that was pulled from Germany in the middle of Berlin during the 1940s. This was something that was made in Oklahoma during the 1940s in a prisoner of war camp. Like that alone, just like describing that, it seems like an anomaly almost. So yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, especially then, like I said, the mural that's there and those handkerchiefs, those are really interesting in terms of what they were used for when thinking about people who were trying to escape. Right? People were making these handkerchiefs so they could make a map for themselves as they tried to escape. But, I mean, that's using the resources you got.
Other questions, comments?
I was an age during World War II, and I was old enough to know what was going on, but I was too young to go to the Army. My father had a garage here in town, and some of the U.S. personnel come in and out of there, and I kind of picked up on different things. I remember there was one officer that came in quite frequently that was in the intelligence.
Okay.
And of course, he couldn't talk about much, but we did become aware that his main duty was to dress and act like a non-com without the Germans knowing, and also without them knowing that he knew the German language. It's
Okay.
his job to go around there and keep tabs on what they were talking about. And I thought that was
That's
pretty
amazing.
slick idea.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Then there was, southeast of Alva was settled by quite a few Germans.
Yeah.
And a lady went out to her barn one morning and discovered in her hangnail a prisoner. She talked to him in German and took him back to camp.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, and I was actually talking with Professor Schmalter, that kind of intel and like doing that kind of thing was nothing new. There's actually multiple like pages upon pages from British intelligence sent to Alva saying, hey, these guys aren't saying, they're not telling you really who they are. They're actually this rank. This is their full name. This is, they're members of the SS, the SA, that, yeah, like there was even lengths that they would go to switching uniforms while they were being transferred, right? So they would switch with an enlisted man who was a lower rank, and they would, make up their own story of who they were. So like some of the pictures that they have, that might not even be their real names. So yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. And there's actually, I mean, talking about like intelligence like that, the British were awesome at this. They definitely made James Bond seem like it was a real thing. Because there's actually a book that came out recently by Salka Nietzschel called Soldaten on fighting, killing, and something else. And basically, they took this mansion, essentially, in Britain, Wilton Park, and they put high-ranking officials and officers in this building, wired the entire house. In the basement, British intelligence was sitting, just listening, and writing down every single conversation they had. We got so much intelligence from them just doing that. And these men didn't know. They just thought that they were being treated like officers, like high-ranking prisoners. And the book's amazing. But on top of that, you also see, they did also wire a couple barracks. And you kind of see more, like what I was getting at with the one poem, is you start to see the identity of who these guys really are. Right? And that was kind of what I set out to do originally, but how much I had, it kind of changed. But what really is a Nazi? Like, what are these different degrees of Nazism? Like, are they strictly anti-Semitic? Are they going against the norm of liberal democracy and socialism and communism? Like, what is their dish? Like, what makes them Nazi? What makes them a Nazi? But, yeah, I mean, that's awesome.
Do you think we had a particularly high percentage of?
I think by the time that these guys are being expatriated, once we get to 45, I think it probably is. So the camp really comes together in early 43. That first year and a half, our screening process is terrible. Like, there's no getting around it. It's just really bad. And mainly, it's not even our fault completely. Partially it is because we got rushed into it and we were like, yeah, okay, here's a camp system. But part of it is that when these men would go from collection camp to collection camp and they would get transferred around, a lot of times what they were categorized as would change. So when they were first collected, they would be placed by nationality. All the Germans together, Italians, so on and so forth. Then it would be by rank. Then it would be kind of mixed again. And then by the time that it got to even Britain and then to the U.S., those screening processes would be different as well. So if you were considered a Nazi in Britain, you might get to U.S. and it might be completely different. So once you get into late 44, into 45, that's where you see in 44 is the boom of these transfer records, particularly with Alva. I have a stack of them back in Milwaukee that's literally just transfer records of these guys being basically, hey, this threat was put on my life because I said something against Hitler, and he got transferred out like a week later. So they were making an effort to definitely get the right people in the camp and try to isolate them from others that maybe were afraid.
I had always understood that Alva was considered a very rough camp, and in some of the other camps around, one of their things was, so you better shape up or we're going to send you to Alva.
Yeah, that was actually in, it was actually in a source that's at the Alva Public Library. There is literally I think he was at Tunkawa, where Kunze was killed, Corporal Kunze, the guy that I quoted at the end, near the end, that he literally told someone at one point, yeah, if you do not shape up, I'll send you to the Nazi lager. Literally, it was the term that people would use for Camp Alva. So you could say Alva or Nazi lager, and people would know that, and they would not want to go there, especially once we got later. Yeah, so.
You mentioned about the open house. I remember on a Sunday afternoon, we went to the open house out here, between the finishing of the camp and before the prisoners came in.
Yeah.
And it was really a tar paper shack town, because it wasn't built to be permanent. And it, the thing I remember impressed me the most was, they had a pretty, great big red fire engine. It was better than anything we had downtown.
Yeah.
I remember also at different times you'd hear something about that they were eating better out there than we were.
I was gonna say that.
But you know, I think that paid off, because a lot of those, when they went, of course, everybody, all of them had to go home. They went back home, some of them became officials in the government, this and that. And I think part of the relationship between Germany and us has to do with the way they were treated.
I completely agree, and I mean, I think that's why I was actually going to say that about the eating better. That becomes a big issue at other camps and in other communities. It becomes a very big issue about eating better and that kind of idea, especially with ration books and everything.
Yeah,
else
when you
being
take,
used.
you have to take your ration books to get some types of food.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
they're
and
living without a ration.
yeah, and in terms of them going back home and kind of contributing that, I mean, I think that actually would be a large reason why maybe the writing about these camps has been largely ignored, about these men returning home. I was telling Professor Schmalzer that the majority of the literature on these guys returning home is actually from those returning from the Soviet camps, not from American camps, a little bit about British camps, but Britain becomes problematic because that's where they get sent to a lot and then they get expatriated back. But the Soviet camps treated them poorly, so bad. And we're talking about the gulags and other things like that, they definitely influenced that. These guys come back from the US and they don't look like they struggled sometimes, right, with how well they're being treated, comparatively, right? I mean, if we're looking at Soviets to the American camp system, and that's actually what I'll be looking at for my dissertation is kind of what were these guys perceiving when they came home, to maybe no home at all, to displaced Germans coming into the country and basically setting up shanties almost, right? Were they being looked down upon because of how well they were treated compared to those in the Soviet Union? Or if they were just seen as a victory for coming home, right? And going back to that idea brought up with YMCA, like, was it just awesome to actually see them come home?
You mentioned the group that came over years later
Mhm.
to visit.
Yeah.
They first wrote County Garden the mayor to see if they'd be welcome.
Yeah.
And he told them, yes, you will be. And then the comment, and there was quite a group that toured the town and everything with them. And it came out in the paper or something to the effect that when they asked how now compared with back then, said, well, one thing regarded by a whole lot more people today.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's the other thing too, is that I'm really interested to get over to Germany to see some of these archives. Is those types of associations where that individual wrote the mayor. I mean, those associations are huge in Germany, like down to the records of what these guys' heights and weights were when they enlisted, and then where they were captured, where they were killed, where they went missing. It's a lot better than maybe sometimes some of our source material, and I'm intrigued to definitely to maybe try to get to some of those associations. Who knows how many there will be there at the time, but their families could definitely they're the other ones kind of picking up the torch at this point that I've seen. So yeah.
This is kind of off the subject, but when you think about how Camp Alva was run, how the prisoners was treated, they didn't go home starved or lonely. And if you go to Europe and go to Germany to like the Dachau or some of the prison camps that we've been to, it's horrifying. The pictures and how the here to Germany had to feel bad about how the.
Oh, definitely, yeah, I mean,
Like Wayne
it's,
said a minute ago, that it helped influence the government to do better.
yeah, I mean, and I had a picture of it, and I didn't really say anything about it, but, I mean, it's unavoidable, particularly if we're talking about a camp that was reserved for Nazi enthusiasts, true believers, as I called them. It's unavoidable that some type of effect from the Holocaust is going to come up, right? And I think that might also be the case, is in the original post-war period, they didn't want to really acknowledge it. They didn't know how to acknowledge it. And I think that's why these stories of the Heimkehr are so thrown up, because it's yes, something's happening positive, right? These men are returning home, and it's not until well later where East and West Germany both decide on how they want to treat the Holocaust in history. And that's not until well later that it really becomes a main issue for these two new countries that were from one.
It's quite sobering to visit
Yeah.
the death chambers.
Mm-hmm.
My
That's just.
son is a contract doctor to one of the bases over there,
Mm-hmm.
and we go visit him, and it's interesting the different things that he knows that we go look at. Some of it's kind of scary.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think again too that that's a kind of the other side of them coming home, is how are they going to face that?
Yes.
And, you know what I mean? And then how is that going to be maybe brought into how the general population treats them, right? Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm completely fascinated with German history. It's not. There's so many different ways to look at things, and especially the culture and the society and kind of the politics of everything, that it's not a simple cut and dry thing. I mean, everyone in here could probably say history never is, but they've had the short end of the stick a lot more times than some, at least in terms of Europe, right? So, in Central Europe. So,
But the German people right next door did not know what was going on, because I think it's Dachau, where the train would go all the way through the wall inside, and they'd log in there and then come back out. So even somebody just next door would not know what was going on.
yeah, and that's also been talked about a lot with scholars, is how much did general population not really know? You know what I mean? Or how much was it them just turning a blind eye? Which is still being debated in large part. So yeah, I mean, it's, again, you can't get away from images and pictures like that that all of us have probably seen, and all of us have probably seen some type of film depicting it in some way, which is also going to influence how you remember it and how you think of it. Or if you go, because I have not been able to go to Germany and see some of these things, but even going, from my personal experience, to the Holocaust Museum in D.C., that's also a very sobering experience as well. So,
Our
yeah,
mural
so
that
that
we had isn't quite accurate on how they looked. They weren't just milling around. They were marching down the street, some of them doing a goose step.
yeah.
With our guards all flanking them on each side. And in fact, I gave my own enough time on that. With the little boy and mother in the back part of that picture is me and my mom. Because I have stood on Central National Bank Point and watched them march by. And they were a bedraggled bunch, looked like they had on the same clothes where they were captured at. Arms and slings, this and that. But some of them would be doing the goose step.
Okay. Yeah, and then I think, I forget where I saw that, but yeah, I mean, that was definitely brought up as well, that even, and they couldn't do anything, technically, right? Because of what I talked about in the Geneva Convention, right? They're clear to be able to do that kind of marching if they wanted to. They couldn't do anything really to stop it and not kind of be violating something, which is both terrifying but logical at the same point, right? You can't take away someone's identity and who they're fighting for, but at the same time, that has to, again, cause some fear in the general public and the general population within the city. I mean, as you're watching that happening, right? I mean, that has an obvious effect.
I guess any more questions, comments? And Kyle, do you have any business cards or contact information? Or we can supply that later too, but if
Yeah,
you had anything we could,
yeah, I don't have any right now, but yeah, I can definitely give
be
some
following your
contact
research in the
information.
future. That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Very good, thank you for coming.